And he's kind of a cognate of Apollo or Neptune. Not Apollo. What am I talking about? Why can't I get this intro? This is the 4th time. I just haven't sent you all of them. Conas, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelittales YouTube channel. Today we are talking about one of the most important Irish gods, a really potent figure who turns up in all of the mythological cycles, Manannán mac Lir, King of the Sea. You can think of him as kind of a cognate of Neptune or Poseidon, but personality-wise, he's a little bit different. He's usually counted as one of the Tuireann, and if you want to know more about the Irish gods and who they were and what we know about them and don't know about them, you can click over onto our explainer video over here. I'm just gesturing vaguely because I don't know where the link goes. But let's get into Manannán. So we talked in our Irish gods video a little bit about, the ambiguity, the uncertainty around these gods. I'm not going to go into all of that again. This is just kind of to say, if you have a different understanding of this god, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are wrong and I am right, or vice versa. It just means that there are a multiplicity of different sources, different ideas, and there's no one true source for any of this stuff. It's folklore, it's mythology, it's oral tradition that was then transcribed into a written tradition by people of a new faith that were then colonized by still more people who outlawed the language. There are layers and layers and layers of disruption in this tradition. So we don't have a pure, this is exactly what ancient Irish people believed. But I'm just going to tell you what I know from spending the last 10-15 years as a storyteller of Irish mythology. And I would very much like to hear what you know in the comments. So, Manannán mac Lir. Well, first off, the name comes from an old Irish word, Lir, which means sea. So he's Manannán, sort of son of the sea. The sea itself is not ever personified in Irish mythology, so it's just kind of an honorific. He is so of the sea that he's related to it. It's probably worth mentioning who he's not related to at this point, because there's a very, very famous Irish folktale called The Children of Lir, and a lot of people see Lir and see Manannán mac Lir and assume that Lir is Manannán's father. He isn't. He's nothing to do with him. It's a much, much later folktale, and he's just a very different character. So who he was he was the king of the sea. He's very much associated with the seas around Ireland and Great Britain, and I guess the Irish Sea is sort of mainly his domain because the Isle of Man takes its name from him. Manannán, Isle of Man. I don't know the exact linguistic descent of that, but apparently that was sort of identified as being his home base in a lot of the stories. You also have this idea of there being 3 times 50 islands of the other world out west from Ireland. There were all of these islands that sometimes moved or disappeared. So he's variously identified as living on the Isle of Man or on an island called Tuireann, which is the land of promise. Then there's the land of plenty, and then there's Tuireann, which is the land of youth. And if you are good at pattern recognition, now you know the Irish for land of, which is Tír, country. He's also sometimes linked to Tír, which is the country under wave, or the land under wave, which is another sort of concept in Irish mythology. Now, he's very, very linked with several other characters in Irish mythology. He has a number of children. His daughters turn up. His daughter Cleanna is sometimes called the Queen of the Banshees. And another of his daughters, Ní of Kinor, shows up in a big way in the Fianna cycle in a very famous story called Oisín in Tír. She's the one who takes Oisín off to Tír to meet her dad, Manannán. Now, there's a lot to be said about a lot of the gods of Irish mythology. Some of them have kind of interesting stuff. Some of them have interesting items. The Dagda has his cauldron, Lugh has his spear, and Manannán has, I think, the most impressive just kit bag out of all of them. He sort of has the best stuff because he has a lot of stuff and it's all very, very magical. So starting with his horse, he has a horse called Éanbar, which is able to run across the waves and run across the land equally easily, and that draws his chariot. This is also probably the white horse that Niamh Kinor rides in the story of Oisin and Tir na Nog, because she rides a white horse across the waves. It's not named in that story, but like it's probably Envar. He's also got a boat called Scuubtana, which is Old Irish for the wave sweeper. And this is a boat that features pretty heavily in a story called The Fate of the Sons of Tuireann. The Sons of Tuireann were sent on a huge rambling quest to get an Eric fine because they killed someone. I gotta not tell the whole story every single time. It's on our podcast though. We do have a telling of it on our podcast. But they managed to get a hold of Scuubtana, which kind of makes their quest. It takes it from impossible to like really, really hard. But Scuubtana, you only have to say the name of a destination and the boat takes you there before you have time to draw another breath. So also able to travel over land and over water, incredibly, incredibly powerful. He has a magical sword called Fragrach, which means the answerer, because there's a lot of questions you can answer by just saying, well, actually, I have a really big sword. This is at one time lent to the Ulster hero Naoise, and this comes up in the story of Deirdre and the Sons of Ishnach. It actually has a tragic role in that story because it ends up beheading Naoise and his two brothers in one blow, because it can do that. It can behead 3 men in one blow. That's how powerful the sword Fragrach is. He has a bag called the Crane Bag. The Crane Bag has a little bit of a tragic origin story. Manannán killed a crane when he was out hunting one day, only to realise too late that it was actually a woman who had been cursed and transformed into a crane because she had a jealous rival who wanted her man and turned her into a crane. It didn't work. She stayed with her Phila poet boyfriend and followed him around as a crane, being like his muse. But Manannán didn't know that, and he was out hunting and he shot her and he killed her, and she told him the whole story, but it was too late. She was already dying. So in a sort of act of contrition, he made her skin into this bag, and he made the bag, the Crane Bag, the repository of all of the treasures of the sea. So it was open at high tide and it was closed at low tide, so the treasures of the sea are forever just out of reach of mortal hands because we can't get at it while it's open. It's also, I think, is the same bag as the Oxter bag, which shows up in the Fianna stories as having a slightly different role. It kind of works like a bag of holding in D&D, like you reach into it and you pull out whatever the thing is that you need the most in that moment. So it also has a role in that particular story cycle. And his last magical item, and certainly not the least, is his magical cloak. Manannán has a cloak that if he shakes it between two people, they will never, ever, ever meet again. And this comes up in the story of The Only Jealousy of Emer, which is a story where Cuchulainn has an affair with Manannán's wife, Fand. And in order to separate the two lovers at the end, and in order to reconcile with his wife, Manannán shakes the cloak between the two of them. And there's another time that it shows up, but we'll get to that. So one of the big things about Manannán is that he's a little bit more involved than a lot of the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann. A lot of these Celtic gods are they're a little bit aloof. They might show up in some cycles. Like the Morrigan shows up in the Ulster cycle pretty heavily, but she's not really in any of the other ones. Whereas Manannán Maglir shows up in all of the major story cycles. But Manannán, I think he's kind of the only one. He's the only one that I know of that turns up in all 4. So obviously in the mythological cycle, which is about the Tuatha Dé Danann and about them coming to Ireland and about them fighting wars for Ireland, he shows up in the mythological cycle like as a character. He's kind of one of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He's also arguably maybe not. He may have been here before them. And there is a story there's a version rather of the story of the Battle of Taltu, where Manannán is the one who created the other world. And that version is that when the sons of Mill, who were the ancestors of the Celts, met the Tuatha Dé Danann in battle, Manannán shook his cloak between the armies, and that act was what created the other world. The other world is like a hugely important concept in Celtic mythology. It's this idea that there is a world that lies right alongside our world and is just out of sight and is just out of reach, and it's where the dead go, it's where the ancestors go, and it's also where the Tuatha Dé Danann and the magical people live, and the magical creatures also live there. So this version has it that There was no other world up until the Battle of Taltu, and it was the Battle of Taltu and the aftermath of it that actually created this other world. That's, some people say that. Some people say the other world was always there and the Tuireann just went in there. And then another version of the Battle of Taltu is that the Tuireann were slaughtered, and that's why they're in the other world, because they were killed and they're dead, and that's where the dead go. So he's in the mythological cycle that way. I mentioned already the story of Fand and her love affair with Cuchulainn, which is mainly his intervention in the Ulster cycle. He turns up a good bit in the Fianna cycle, often as a kind of trickster character. And again, peripherally, as the father of Niamh Kinor in that very famous story about Oisín. The main thing that he gets involved with, the main cycle that he just seems to be like really bet into, is the king cycle. Because Manannán seems to be really, really interested in leadership and kingship. So he crops up a lot in the king cycle. In various different stories. He's plays a significant role, probably the most significant role, in the story of Cormac MacArt. There is an episode called Cormac MacArt and the Land of Promise, when Cormac is sort of old and, past his middle years and feeling like life has lost its excitement. Manannán turns up with a silver branch in disguise, mind you. He's often in disguise when he just shows up. And he gets Cormac to ask him for the silver branch because the silver branch is this beautiful, looks like a tree branch with golden apples on it, and when it's shaken it makes the most beautiful music, so beautiful that it heals any wounds or any sickness of anyone listening, which is the kind of a concept that comes up a few times in Irish myth, the healing power of music. So after Cormac asks for this magic silver branch, Manannán agrees, but takes his wife and his children as payment without Cormac realising what he's agreed to. And it turns out that his whole aim the whole time was just to lure Cormac MacArt to follow him to the Land of Promise. And Cormac spends this weird time in the Land of Promise, seeing all these weird allegorical sights and this strange sort of dream logic place. And then at the end of it, Manannán kind of goes, yeah, hey, it was me. I brought you here to teach you wisdom. You get to keep the silver branch, and also here's a magic lie detecting cup, and goodbye and good luck. And that's kind of the end of it. So he's sort of he's a teacher in a very trickster kind of a way. He shows up in this wonderful way in the story of the Voyage of Bran. This is a story about a king called Bran MacFiall who decides to take off for the other world, and he meets Manannán as they're sailing into the beyond, and as they're kind of beginning this journey into this weirdness of the otherworld islands. The first person they meet is Manannán, who is on his chariot on top of the waves. And he calls out to them and he shows them his silver branch, which he's carrying at the time. And he also tells them that hey, I'm not on waves. I'm not riding a horse over waves. In fact, you are sailing a ship through a meadow. This is a grassy plain. There are flowers. There are sheep grazing. I see this world differently than you. Which is just a kind of a great little scene of the other world and the sort of real world being in opposition to each other. Because it's no, you're not right and I'm not wrong. We are just seeing things profoundly differently, which I think is very cool. What's also cool about that little interlude is that he leaves them telling them that he has to go to Ulster to father a king, which is a tie-in with another story. And that hardly ever happens in Irish mythology, where you actually get a little tie-in that strong. And of course, the other story is the story of the conception of King Mongan. Mongan was a king of Ulster. He's another part of the king cycle, and he has a bizarre backstory. It's on our podcast, but to make a long story as short as I possibly can, because I feel like this video is already going to be 1,000,000 years long. Mongan's father is one of 2 kings of Ulster. He gets involved in a dispute in Scandinavia and ends up having to go to war against the king of Scandinavia, who, unbeknownst to him, has a herd of vicious man-eating sheep, which are not portrayed as being from the other world. They're just kind of portrayed as being that's what Scandinavian sheep are like. And I don't know. I have not been. I don't know if sheep in Scandinavia are man-eating, but they were back then, apparently. So this king asked Manannán for help, and Manannán agreed on condition that he be allowed to sleep with the king's wife. So he disguised himself as the King of Ulster, slept with his wife, and then turned up 9 months later to say, I'm going to claim my son and take him off to the other world and raise him. And he did. And Mongan himself became a king, and there's a whole Mongan story, which is on the podcast if anyone wants to check it out. We will put links. So okay, so far so good. Manannán seems like a pretty stand-up guy. In a lot of these stories, he isn't always great. He does have that trickster side to him. Sometimes the trickster stuff is like, you know, for your own good. And sometimes it really isn't. There's probably the nastiest that you see him is in the story of Cleanna's Wave. Cleanna is his daughter. She disobeyed him and left the other world in order to run away with a mortal lover who subsequently died quite soon, actually. So Manannán sent 9 waves against her, and the 9th one drowned her, which is a bit fucking harsh, but there you go. And he shows up also as a trickster in the Fianna cycle, sometimes taking on the disguise of the Bodach, who's a kind of a churlish, buffoonish sort of fairy creature. So Manannán disguises himself as the Bodach, and in one story he infiltrates a king's hall, mocks the musicians so brutally that they stop playing, then takes over playing the music and heals everybody's wounds because he's so brilliant at it, then incites all the guards to murder each other and then brings them all back to life. So he's chaotic neutral, maybe? I also forgot to mention he's the foster father of Lula Fada, which is probably one of his bigger roles in the Book of Invasions. And I should have said that earlier, but I'm not going to go back there. Maybe editing will fix this. Maybe it won't. So let us know. Had you heard of Manannán MacLear before? Are you familiar with these stories? Are you familiar with this figure? I think we've mentioned him in videos before, but this is kind of a little bit of a deeper dive. Do you have any more questions that we could answer? Is your curiosity piqued, or are there other aspects of Irish folklore and mythology that you would like us to do videos about? Let us know in the comments below. If you want more stories, you can check out our podcast. We've left links to as many of the stories that I mentioned here as I was able to remember. If you would like to get some of this information in book format, there is a book coming out in August. You can pre-order it now, called Celtic Mythology by Sorcha Hegarty and Aaron Hegarty, and we're very happy about it. Also available in audiobook format. One of the biggest ways you can support the channel is by engaging with these videos, by subscribing to the channel, by liking, by sharing, by telling other people about it. Or if you want to directly support us, you can come over and join our Candlelit crew, and there is a link in the description about how to do that. If you don't want to do any of that, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. You!